Is 9mm really as good as 40 Smith & Wesson? Today we're testing our Golden Saber bonded. I'm going to use a couple different barrel lengths, and this should be a very fair test. So a lot of people nowadays say that 9mm is the go-to cartridge, and you know, it's kind of confusing because for a long time everybody said 40 was the go-to cartridge and it was better. Now with modern bullet technology, 9mm is supposed to be better. So I thought I would do as fair a test as possible with some Golden Saber bonded. See how this does. So we're using 5-inch pistols and 3.2-inch pistols, both the same make and model. Like our 5-inch barrels are Smith & Wesson M&Ps, MP9 and MP40 5-inch barrel. Then our Taurus G2Cs, both of those are 3.2-inch barrel. I got one in 9mm and one in 40 Smith & Wesson. So our 9mm is a 147 grain. It's rated at 990 feet per second, and our 40 Smith & Wesson is a 180 grain rated at 1015 feet per second. So those bullet weights actually equate to almost identical sectional density as well. So that really is just a scaled up 9mm when we're talking about that 40. So this should be a fair test, give us some idea how 40 compares to 9mm. So we're going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy we can get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So with this test, I'm going to do my real world simulation with every one of these shots. 4 layers of sweatshirt material, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. Clear ballistics is roughly a half representation of the density of flesh. So whatever you see in here would be about half that far in an actual living target. So if you got 15 inches here, it'd be like 7.5 inches on a real living target. So this should be an interesting test. We'll do our ballistics gel test, and then I will shoot at the steel target and see if there's a big difference in the recoil and shootability with those. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up, we'll run our 9mm through 2 different barrel lengths, through our 5-inch barrel M&P, then through our 3.2-inch barrel Taurus G2C. So 147 grain rated at 990 feet per second. I believe that's through a 4-inch barrel. Let's see how close we get to 990 in this 5-inch barrel here. I'm just going to do 3-round averages. 9mm 5-inch barrel. See how this does. 1035. 1037, 1036. So yeah, that's pretty good consistency and above rated velocity, which it should be through a 5-inch barrel. 3.2-inch barrel. Let's see how close we get to 990. 1001, 997, 989. Good job, Remington. Above rated velocity even through a 3.2-inch barrel. Now we'll move on to our 40 Smith & Wesson. It's rated at 1015. I didn't look up the barrel lengths, but I think that probably is through a 4-inch barrel. So 180 grain rated at 1015. Let's see how close we get to that in our 5-inch barrel here. 990, 1021, 1011. I would say the average is a little bit low, but it's close enough that I'm not going to complain too much. 3.2-inch barrel. See how close we get to 1015 in this. 957. Oh, magazine fell out of this pistol. What a piece of junk. 915. 963. So, not super impressive, but not terrible either. Let's hit our ballistics gel block with our real world simulation and see how these all compare. All right, our real world simulation ballistic gel test. We're going through 4 layers of sweatshirt material, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics that represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. I like these bolts to stay within that back rib simulation without passing through, but if they go about 3 inches past, that back rib simulation, that's acceptable. They likely would not pass through an average size individual from a front on shot. So let's see what we get here with our 9mm through our 5-inch barrel. All right. Now we'll do our 40 from our 5-inch barrel. Let's take a look. And there's a big difference there in that overall penetration. Energy dump is a little bit greater with our 9mm in this first 3-inch piece than our 40. Both are expanded really well, but the 9mm got a lot better penetration. Hit that back rib simulation, so that's fine on penetration. Our 40 though, kind of under penetrated a little bit. I don't know if that's, it's the same sectional density, so you would think it wouldn't, but yeah, I guess that much size is just too much size, and it kind of underpenetrated. I don't mind rounds like that because I realize as a civilian, I'm not typically going to be likely to have to shoot through an arm from the side when somebody's running from me and shooting back. But, for law enforcement, that's a little bit shallow. So our 9mm looks pretty good. We have a penetration hitting that back rib simulation of 19 inches, which is pretty good. Now with our 40 Smith & Wesson, we only got about 11 3/4 inches, so just a hair shallow in my opinion there. But that could just be because it's a 5-inch barrel, and that's kind of making that expansion a little bit too much, just because the velocity is kind of high. But at the same time, we didn't actually get that high of velocity. It wasn't really over the rated, so I don't know. Let's hit this now with our short barrels and see how they compare now. All right, our 3.2-inch barrel test, 9mm real world simulation. All right, let's hit that with our 40 Smith & Wesson. Let's go take a look. All right, about the same thing with the 9mm, a little bit quote unquote better with the 40, just because it did penetrate a little bit more. Looking at this, our 9mm actually has a pretty good size wound track. The 40, it's an interesting thing because it is the same size. It's just that the angle of this gel kind of tilts it. It probably sounds like I'm making that up, but I'll try to show this the best I can. Where if you go from a different angle here, you can see how wide that 40 track is right there. But from the front view here, it looks very small. So the actual tracks are about the same size right here. It's just that the 9mm goes deeper with that. Here's our rib simulation. I taped it up so it doesn't like fall to pieces, and we got good expansion before hitting this with every one of these rounds. So those are totally fine when it comes to the amount of expansion getting right away. So I would say both of these performed really well out of the short barrel. Again, our 9mm went to 19 inches. Our 40 went to about 14 1/4 inches. So it is really hard to call this. Yes, the 9mm is going to penetrate more reliably more often because it is a 147 grain. I would have thought the 40 would have penetrated just as far, but it is a little bit shallow. So it's hard for me to call it because I actually prefer less penetration with the rounds that I carry, because I feel like if you look at some of the old school quote unquote stopping power numbers and stuff like that, real world data, it does show a little bit higher if they penetrate a little bit less because they're opening up quicker and causing more damage where it counts. So I would call this that currently with this particular ammo, The 9mm is going to be a little bit better law enforcement round because of its penetration, and the 40 is going to be a little bit better regular guy concealed carry round because it dumped its energy a little bit shallower. So they're a lot more different with this ammo than what I was expecting to see. That's interesting. I thought we were going to get shallow penetration with the 9 and the 40 wasn't going to expand with the short barrel and over penetrate, but hey, not bad overall. So let's pull these out of the block. We'll take a close-up look at these bullets. Then I'll shoot our steel and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets, and these are the ones from our 5-inch barrel here. So there is a pretty big difference in the overall size of these, which accounts for why, you know, one of them penetrated a lot further. Here's our 9mm, and here's our 40 Smith & Wesson. So I would say that difference in overall diameter is pretty significant. You know, the 9mm penetrates more reliably, but the 40, I would not want to get hit with that 40 from a front-on shot, I'll say that much. Now our 3.2-inch barrels, about the same difference here. I think they're a little bit closer to each other with the shorter barrels. Our 9mm and our 40. 40 got quite a bit bigger. So again, you know, you're putting more energy, more shallow in the target with this. This is just, you know, making it more reliably a deep shot. So both had good performance. I can't say like one is better and one is worse. It's just for different applications, I think they could have different uses. Like I personally would carry that and I would use it for home defense. If I was in charge of ammo for a law enforcement agency, I'd probably be wanting to give this. This is low recoil and penetrates reliably through side shots. So interesting. That's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target, just our practical shootability drill. So with this, I just want to see if there's so much of a difference in recoil that it makes it hard to make follow-up shots with one versus the other. I suspect that through the 5-inch barrels, there's not going to be a problem, but going to the 3.2-inch barrels, there might be a little bit of a problem. So 9mm 5-inch barrel, 14 yards. I'm going to pop these off as fast as I think I can hit the target. So here's our 9mm. So I don't really have a problem there. Very low recoil of that 5-inch pistol. Now our 40, same pistol basically. See how this does. And honestly, not that big of a difference. It's like with the 9mm, I don't feel recoil, but with the 40, I feel it. But it doesn't actually affect my ability to get the follow-up shot back on target. So interesting how that is. Now our short barrels here, 9mm subcompact pistol. Let's see how this does. All right, I don't have a big problem with that. That's about as difficult as firing the 40 from the 5-inch pistol, so it's still pretty easy. Now this is where it might become more difficult. See how this does for me. I had to slow down just a little bit with that. And I could feel the grip kind of digging into my fingers a little bit. So interesting. So I'm going to say that probably a 4-inch barrel and above with a good frame size is probably you're better off with 40. But if you're going down to little subcompact pistols, the shootability does become a problem a little bit with bigger calibers. So 9mm and those little compact concealed carry guns is a good option. You know, there is a reason why, you know, one of my vehicle carry guns is the 5-inch 40. And I don't vehicle carry this, even though this is more of a truck gun, because I know that the recoil is manageable on a little bit bigger pistol. So it's one of those things you got to know a little bit about what you're doing, not just be like this caliber versus this caliber period, because there's so many little details that come up that make a big difference in your overall caliber selection based on the actual gun you're getting. So to me, this is interesting to look at this because, you know, I'm actually a younger Gen Xer, even though I don't look like it. Most people think I'm 10 years younger than what I am. But looking at all this, you know, I grew up, I had friends that started concealed carrying right around the year 2000, and back then it's like they would just talk about the 40, the 40, the 40, the 40. If you brought up 9mm, like 9mm, why would you carry 9mm? Interestingly enough, they would say the same thing about 45, like 45. 40 Smith & Wesson was where it was at, period. You were scoffed at if you were not carrying a 40. That was a big deal to carry a 40. And I actually got this comment a couple days ago. Why 40 when 9mm is the go-to choice for law enforcement? I'm like, from the year 1990 until about 2015, 40 Smith & Wesson was the go-to caliber. It was the go-to caliber. And really what happened is the FBI switched to the 9mm just so they could get those scores of qualifying up a lot easier. And then you get just enough performance with the 9mm that's going to do what they want it to do. Doesn't make it equal to the 40. It just means across the board, the 9mm is better for a bunch of, law enforcement agents. That never really clicked with me why in America, when we have all the choices that we could pick from, we can carry whatever you want. Why go to the 9mm when it was designed currently, for law enforcement should be just barely enough? That just never made sense to me, but interesting test. So looking at the performance, overall, I'm going to give it to the 9mm today, even though I absolutely love 40 Smith & Wesson, just because this particular 9mm did really well. It penetrated really deep and did a lot of damage. If you actually calculated the actual permanent wound channels in that, it would be higher with the 9mm because it went deeper. But in the real world, I think the 40 is going to do probably a little bit better with front-on shots. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult to control the recoil. So interesting nonetheless. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like. And thanks for watching.